The private heliport baked under the midday sun. A $5 million executive helicopter sat immobile on the tarmac, a monument to silent technical failure. A nervous circle of engineers huddled nearby. Alexandra Reed, the billionaire CEO, exited her sedan, radiating impatience. Her sharp eyes landed on Jack Miller, the airport janitor, holding his worn toolbox. She fixed him with a cold, mocking stare and laughed with utter, sharp contempt. "Fly this helicopter and I'll marry you." Jack remained silent, but 9-year-old Ben Miller, standing close to the safety fence, looked up at his father, his eyes suddenly wide with question. Jack Miller, at 42, embodied the quiet resilience of a man who had chosen survival over status. He was a single father whose world revolved around the stability he could provide for his son, Ben. Jack's official title at the private airfield was Maintenance Support Specialist, but his day-to-day work was primarily that of a janitor, sweeping hangar floors, cleaning oil spills, and helping ground crew with minor menial tasks. It was a humble, demanding, and predictable job, exactly what he needed. Very few people knew the truth concealed behind his faded uniform and tired eyes. Jack Miller was a ghost of a legend. He had once been Major Jack Miller, call sign Maverick, an elite military helicopter pilot, a man whose hands had commanded multi-ton war machines through impossible weather and life-or-death situations. He was a recipient of high honors and multiple commendations, a true master of rotary wing flight dynamics. His skill wasn't just in flying, it was in field mechanics, the ability to rebuild a gearbox blindfolded under enemy fire. His celebrated military career ended abruptly 7 years ago after a devastating accident during a high-risk extraction mission in a remote conflict zone. The crash wasn't his fault. A ground navigation error was later confirmed as the cause. But Jack had been the one at the controls. He survived the crash, but his co-pilot, his wife, Captain Sarah Miller, did not. The overwhelming trauma, coupled with the immediate consuming responsibility of raising Ben, led him to seek absolute solitude and stability. He walked away from the pilot's seat forever, trading the thunder of rotor blades for the quiet dignity of a mop and bucket. He never spoke of his medals. He simply raised Ben. The contrast between his two lives was stark. The multi-million-dollar executive helicopter shimmered with polished aluminum and complex carbon fiber, a symbol of high-powered, high-stakes corporate ambition. Jack's toolbox, by contrast, was old, dented metal, holding simple wrenches and screwdrivers, tools for physical reality, not digital status. Ben, 9 years old, was Jack's constant companion during the long daytime shifts. The boy was intimately familiar with the scent of aviation fuel, the constant low roar of jet engines, and the rhythmic clinking of his father's old, faithful toolbox. Ben was the reason Jack accepted the low wage and the humiliation. The predictable schedule allowed him to be both breadwinner and sole parent. His priority was fixed, stability for Ben above all else. The woman who had just insulted him, Alexandra Reed, was the opposite of quiet stability. She was the CEO of Reed Global, a colossal empire spanning renewable energy and advanced aerospace logistics. Alexandra was famous for her uncompromising efficiency. She was accustomed to command and had zero patience for delays. She viewed wasted time as a fundamental failure of competence. This particular flight, now grounded, was critical. It was connected to a multi-billion-dollar contract with a state-run utility in Southeast Asia. She needed to be airborne now to make a time-sensitive, cross-continental video conference at the precise time the foreign stock market opened. The slight delay was costing them millions in opportunity. The high-tech executive helicopter had developed a deeply frustrating, elusive technical fault, paralyzing her entire technical team. Jack, observing from a distance while wiping down a nearby fuel pump, felt an uneasy familiarity with the issue. His intuitive, pilot's understanding of the machine sensed the trouble immediately. The way the engineers were arguing, focused obsessively on software redundancies and fault tolerance calculation instead of core mechanical feedback, told him they were looking in the wrong place. The problem wasn't the code. It was a fundamental, physical imbalance in the flight control augmentation system. He recognized the subtle, dangerous signature of a catastrophic failure point, a ghost from his past. Jack knew the aircraft was not just delayed, it was temporarily a death trap. But the engineers, highly paid and adorned with PhDs, kept their backs to the janitor. They dismissed him entirely. They didn't see a pilot. They saw a stain, an invisible figure existing only to clean up their messes. They relied on digital readouts. Jack relied on feel. His duty was to the aircraft and the people near it. His pride could wait. He tightened his grip on the toolbox, ready to step in, even if it cost him the only predictable income he had. The tension escalated rapidly. The highly specialized maintenance team was locked in a bitter, jargon-heavy dispute. Dr. Kim, the lead engineer, insisted the fault lay in a primary flight display's data integrity mismatch, arguing for hours about redundancy loops and digital validation codes. Meanwhile, the ground supervisor argued for a simpler but equally fruitless hydraulic pressure issue. The dispute was not about the fix. It was about protecting departmental turf and justifying their previous expensive diagnoses. The argument was becoming circular, wasting precious, revenue-losing minutes. Each minute of delay cost Reed Global an estimated $18,000 in market hedging fees and logistical penalties. Alexandra Reed watched the frantic, expensive failure unfold, her face growing colder with every minute. The situation was an insult to her efficiency, and the growing financial bleed made her volatile. She glanced at the immobile helicopter, then her sharp eyes flicked to Jack Miller again. Mr. Peterson, the senior operations manager, attempted to ease the tension with a terrible effort at humor, his smile too wide and clearly forced. He nudged a colleague, and speaking loud enough for the CEO to hear, echoed her previous insult. "Well, Mr. Miller, maybe you should suit up. The boss is offering the ultimate golden parachute contract, marriage and a $5 million ride." Several staff members laughed nervously. The sound echoed hollowly across the tarmac, a soundtrack to Jack's humiliation. Ben, standing by the perimeter fence, visibly flinched. He tightened his small hand around the chain link, his gaze fixed on his father, confusion turning into palpable hurt. Jack felt the insult deep in his chest, not for himself, but for the shame his son was witnessing. He gently pushed his feelings aside. He had a job to do, a critical warning to deliver. The cost of silence was now too high. Jack left his cleaning cart, the faint squeak of its wheels a sudden interruption, and walked toward the technical circle. He bypassed the arguing engineers, heading straight for the cockpit access ladder. "Excuse me," Jack stated, his voice quiet but carrying surprising authority. "I need to check the collective pitch assembly. The friction load on the secondary servo actuator is mismatched. It's not a data error." Dr. Kim spun around, his face flushed with professional arrogance. "Whoa, whoa, whoa! Back off, janitor! You have zero clearance for the flight deck and absolutely zero understanding of our proprietary systems. You are not authorized personnel. It's not the primary flight display, it's the torque coupling. It will shear on takeoff," Jack asserted, ignoring the lack of respect. "The digital error is a symptom. The mechanical instability is the cause. The system is misreading physical friction as a software fault. Let me check the cabin. It's a 5-minute visual inspection." "Are you questioning my diagnostic matrix, Miller?" Dr. Kim challenged, his voice rising in panic. "I have a PhD from MIT in aerospace mechanics with 3 years focused on this very platform. Your only certification is in sanitation. Your hypothesis contradicts our multi-million-dollar diagnostic software output." Alexandra stepped forward, her voice a whip crack of dismissal. "He's right, Mr. Miller. Your authority is limited to spill control. We hire people to clean floors, not to give tactical advice. Now get back to your station. This is not a democracy." Just then, the engineers, desperate and out of options, decided on a high-risk, last-ditch solution, an unsupervised, controlled startup and hover test. A reserve pilot, who was available but highly nervous, climbed into the seat. The engines roared to life. The rotor blades began to spin, slow at first, then accelerating into a powerful, blurring disk. But the entire helicopter shook violently. Not just a wobble, but a deep, stomach-churning shuddering that looked and sounded like the machine was trying to tear itself apart. The vibration was so intense that the ground crew instinctively stepped back, shielding their faces. Jack knew instantly that the failure point was rapidly destabilizing. The metallic sound was the telltale symptom of a catastrophic, terminal fault. The pilot frantically aborted the test, slamming the engines to idle. Jack turned, his eyes finding Ben's. The boy's face was now etched with fear. Jack remembered the oath he took and the promise he made to his son. Never show anger first, only courage. Be the quiet man who fixes the noise. He took a deep breath, the smell of burnt oil and fear heavy in his lungs, and walked toward the now terrified Alexandra. He addressed her directly, bypassing the panicking engineers and the retreating pilot. His tone was level, devoid of emotion, yet utterly definitive, cutting through the anxiety. It won't stay in the air, Ms. Reed. The torque coupling is fractured. If that pilot attempts takeoff, he will die. The airframe will fail completely within 60 seconds of liftoff. The cost will be more than your contract. It will be the cost of a human life, a catastrophic corporate liability, and an FAA investigation that will cripple your company for years. I am telling you, as a specialist, the flight is impossible. The sheer, terrifying certainty in Jack's voice silenced the entire crowd. Alexandra, used to lies and flattery, heard a note of absolute, unvarnished, professional truth, a truth that transcended her financial panic. If you'd like to see how this moment unfolds, you're welcome to subscribe and continue with us. The silence after Jack's statement was heavy and oppressive, broken only by the sharp, metallic sounds of the cooling engine. Alexandra Reed's face, usually a mask of control, was now stripped bare, showing a mixture of fear and dawning comprehension. The reality of the crisis was immediate. The reserve pilot, visibly shaking, handed in his resignation on the spot. Dr. Kim and his team, unable to find a software solution, stood paralyzed by their own academic tunnel vision. The chief logistics officer reappeared, reporting the terminal news. The crucial contract deadline was now only 2 hours away. The clients were demanding immediate action, or they would pull the multi-billion-dollar deal, citing operational negligence. Reed Global's stock was already beginning to slip on rumors of a technical grounding. The company's future was literally stalled on the tarmac. Alexandra looked at Jack, the man she had mocked minutes ago, the man whose prediction of catastrophic failure had just been proven by the violent shuddering. She was still a skeptic, but her logic forced her hand. She had exhausted all her expensive, high-status options. You said you specialized in rapid field diagnostics, Alexandra challenged, her voice tight. What exactly does that mean, Mr. Miller? Jack didn't bother with flowery language or past glories. He spoke only in terms of required action. It means I was trained to strip down and repair this platform in a hostile environment using minimal tools. I was an Apache chief warrant officer, not just the pilot, but the master mechanic responsible for keeping a combat aircraft operational. The issue is a Stage 3 mechanical friction anomaly. The flight control computer is fighting a physical resistance, interpreting it as an electronic error, which leads to the violent instability you witnessed. He continued, his hands already reaching into his toolbox for a specialized gauge. A full replacement of the coupling will take 8 hours. A temporary manual recalibration and stabilization can be done from the cockpit in minutes. I can manually adjust the secondary servo tension to bring the pitch control back into acceptable range. The aircraft will be flyable for a short, critical flight, but it will require absolute physical control. The board representatives watching remotely via video link were shouting at the logistics officer, protesting the insanity of letting an unvetted janitor touch the controls. But the decision was already made. Ruin was certain. This was the only chance. The vice president of operations, his face the color of ash, looked at Jack. You have 10 minutes to make it safe, Miller, and then you fly it. The boardroom on the video feed erupted in chaos. The chief legal counsel screamed about fiduciary duty, the exposure to criminal negligence, and the immediate suspension of all air operations. Alexandra, however, silenced them all with a single, sharp gesture. She knew the market. A 2-hour delay resulting in the loss of this contract would trigger a 15% stock devaluation cascade by the opening bell in Asia, equating to nearly $1 billion wiped out overnight. The CEO's authority was absolute, and she was betting her entire legacy on the janitor's intuition over her engineer's textbooks. Her eyes, usually so calculated, now held a terrifying cold glint of absolute necessity. Jack Miller wasn't just fixing a helicopter. He was the last line of defense against the complete corporate dissolution of Reed Global. Every executive present understood the implied threat. If Jack failed, the entire leadership team, including Alexandra, would face professional ruin. The silence that followed her decision was the heaviest silence Jack had ever experienced, far louder than any battlefield roar. It was the sound of billions of dollars waiting for a mop-wielding mechanic to perform a miracle. Ben, watching from behind the fence, saw the transformation. His father had shed the hunched posture of the janitor. He stood tall, authoritative, a leader again. The boy watched, holding his breath until his lungs ached, as a flurry of activity surrounded Jack. Jack put on the harness. He climbed the ladder and settled into the highly complex flight seat, a place he hadn't sat in for 7 years. The air in the cockpit, usually filled with the scent of leather and electronics, now smelled like dust and memory. His hands moved instinctively to the cyclic control stick, the action utterly familiar, like a surgeon returning to the table. He didn't trust the digital displays. He reached deep into the cockpit side panel, pulling back the access cover with a swift, practiced movement. He inserted his specialized gauge into the linkages of the collective pitch mechanism. He could feel the resistance. He manually accessed the pitch control linkages, adjusting the tension bolts by minute, fractional increments, focusing only on the subtle pressure he felt in his fingertips and the sound of the metal tightening. He was communicating with the machine's physical body, ignoring the chaos of the computers. He gave the thumbs up to the ground crew. The engines were restarted. This time the rotor blades spun up smoothly. The violent vibration was gone, replaced by a quiet, stable hum. The engineers stared at their displays, which still showed a minor fault. But the physical instability, the $5 million problem, was fixed. Jack taxied the aircraft out. He lifted the machine off the ground with the gentle, effortless grace of a master, a movement that defied the weight and complexity of the aircraft. He performed the short, clinical test flight with stunning precision, tilting the aircraft through a tight perimeter check, not showboating, but clinically testing every single axis of the manually stabilized control. Down on the tarmac, Alexandra Reed stood perfectly still. The cold mask had shattered completely. Her eyes tracked the helicopter, then darted to the stunned faces of her executive team. She felt a sickening, profound realization. She had almost destroyed her company by listening to people with diplomas over a man with true wisdom. She realized that the cost of her arrogance was measured not in money, but in the near loss of life and the humiliation of a genuinely noble man. The 10-minute operational window Jack had demanded was closing. He brought the helicopter in, the landing so perfectly smooth, it felt like the machine was kissing the ground. Alexandra had no words. She had found a genius, and she had ridiculed him in front of his son. The price of her arrogant joke had just gone up infinitely, and she knew she had to pay it in full. Jack returned the multi-million-dollar aircraft to its exact spot, setting it down with a feather-light touch. A move that spoke more loudly than any certificate or medal. The roar of the engines faded, replaced by the profound silence of respect and dawning awe. No one laughed, no one spoke. The engineers, humbled and slack-jawed, looked at Jack, no longer seeing a janitor, but an undeniable master of his craft. Their expensive degrees suddenly felt hollow, exposed by the simple manual brilliance of a man they had dismissed. The first action came from the remote board meeting. The furious VP of HR immediately demanded the firing of the security team who failed to vet Jack, and the suspension of Dr. Kim. Alexandra cut them off, her voice ringing with renewed authority. The only personnel change being made today is a promotion, effective immediately. Alexandra walked toward the aircraft. She waited by the ladder as Jack disembarked. Jack's posture was professional, yet unchanged. He did not seek validation. He sought his son. He walked immediately to the safety fence where Ben was waiting. Ben's face was glowing, a mixture of pride, shock, and pure relief. Jack knelt down, putting himself at eye level with his son. He spoke softly, his voice for Ben only. "Are you okay, buddy? Did I scare you?" Ben shook his head fiercely, clinging to his father's uniform. "No, Dad. You were amazing. You were like a superhero." Jack smiled, a rare, genuine smile. He kept his voice low, but his words were meant to teach, not just comfort. "Watch how people change, son. Always remember what they say when they think you're nobody. True power is knowing you can fix something no one else can." The moment was profoundly private, yet publicly witnessed. Alexandra watched the interaction. She realized that the value of the man was not in his ability to fly a helicopter, but in his absolute clarity of purpose, something her billions had never bought. She saw that his commitment to his son was the source of his stability and his professional clarity. The chief pilot, now safe, sheepishly climbed into the restored aircraft to prepare for the actual flight. Jack, having saved the company's financial future, calmly returned to his cleaning cart, his simple duty completed. Dr. Kim, the humiliated MIT graduate, approached Jack, his arrogance replaced by a crushed sincerity. "Mr. Miller," he mumbled, "I don't know what to say. I was wrong, completely and disastrously wrong. I apologize for my words and my blindness." Mr. Peterson, the manager who had joked about the marriage, stood beside him, equally chastened. "We owe you everything, Jack. You saved the company." Jack accepted their apologies with a quiet, disarming humility. He simply nodded. "No worries. Next time, start with the physical mechanics, not the software. The display only shows what the sensors tell it, and sensors lie." He then picked up his mop. Alexandra, standing apart, now saw the uniform not as a symbol of low status, but as a deliberate shield. He was a man who chose anonymity to protect his family and who chose duty over comfort. The respect she offered him, though late and born of financial desperation, was entirely genuine. Jack had taught the ruthless CEO a fundamental lesson about value. Skill is silent, but success roars, and true competence needs no validation. In the quiet, opulent executive lounge, Alexandra Reed wasted no time on pleasantries. The contract was signed, the crisis averted, and the financial bleeding stopped. Now came the reckoning. She addressed the insult head-on before any negotiations. She did not blame the pressure. She did not offer excuses. She stood before Jack, a woman accustomed to being worshipped, and performed the hardest act of corporate leadership, a public, unreserved apology for her arrogance. "Mr. Miller," she began, her tone formal and serious, "my comment earlier, 'Fly this helicopter and I'll marry you,' was unforgivable. It was born of arrogance, privilege, and frustration. It was an insult to your character, your profession, and the dignity you carry. I saw a uniform, not a veteran. I am profoundly sorry. Please accept my apology." Jack simply nodded, accepting the apology without gloating. He wasn't interested in revenge, only resolution and his previous simple life. Alexandra immediately offered him a solution, a correction for her monumental error. "I am offering you the position of Chief Pilot and Director of Flight Operations, effective immediately. The base salary is $800,000, plus performance bonuses and immediate stock options. You will have a private hangar and a dedicated team." Jack leaned back, a faint, almost imperceptible smile touching his lips. He was not swayed by the money, or the power, or the title. He saw the golden handcuffs, the constant travel, the meetings, the 24/7 commitment. He didn't accept immediately. Instead, he presented his terms, firm and non-negotiable, putting his son, Ben, first, just as he had promised himself. He refused the executive life she offered. "Ms. Reed, the only contract I value is the one I have with my son," Jack said calmly, his voice remaining level. "I appreciate the offer, but the life of a chief pilot is incompatible with being a single father. I cannot take that role." Alexandra was momentarily shocked. No one ever refused this much money and power. "Then what is your price, Mr. Miller? Name it." "My price is not financial, it is logistical," Jack replied. I will take the role of senior advisor on flight safety and operational integrity. I require the following conditions. First, absolute non-deployability and limited travel. I must be home for Ben every day at 4 p.m. Second, I need a full-time dedicated allowance for Ben's education and all unexpected family events. Third, I require the sole, unchallengeable authority to ground any aircraft at any time if I perceive a risk without bureaucratic challenge. I will not be a servant to a schedule, Ms. Reed. I will be the ultimate safeguard. Alexandra listened, her gaze unwavering. She didn't see an employee making demands. She saw a true professional defining his boundaries. She understood that his value was tied to his integrity, and his integrity was tied to his son. She stood up and extended her hand again, a gesture of partnership, not hierarchy. Mr. Miller, I agree to all three. You will define the limits of the job. You will be the safety valve. Welcome aboard. Jack shook her hand. The simple, firm gesture completed the most unexpected employment negotiation in Reed global history. Moments later, Jack and Ben left the airfield, walking toward their old dependable pickup truck. Ben's head was held high. The executive helicopter, now carrying Alexandra Reed and the salvage contract team, finally took to the skies behind them, its rotor wash a powerful, echoing sound of success. Alexandra, looking out the window of the ascending aircraft, saw the father and son drive away. She had learned the hardest lesson of her career. Never turn a moment of arrogance into a joke, because the truth might just take flight and leave you watching from the ground. The quietest people often carry the highest, most indispensable skill. If you believe stories like this deserve to be told, leave a comment and subscribe. Sometimes the quietest people carry the highest skill.